thank you again for being here. As the four of us, myself, Paula, Carla, and Liz, introduce ourselves very quickly, we would love to know where you all are calling in from as well. And so if you want to use the chat to let us know your name, your organization, anything else that you want to share with us today, we're really excited to be having this conversation with everyone. My name is Jesse Kohler. I'm the Executive Director of the Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice, or CTIPP, and have had the pleasure of getting to work with Paula and Liz and gotten to know Carla a little bit through the process, and looking forward to getting to know her better throughout this call as well, to bring together a funder briefing to talk about how we are coordinating and aligning around trauma-informed systems change, which is a big conversation in philanthropy right now, as well as pretty much all sectors. And so really excited about this conversation. And Paula, I'll turn it over to you from there just for quick intros.
Great. Hello, everyone. Really excited to be here with you all this afternoon. This is a really important discussion. I'm Paula Sammons. I'm a Senior Program Officer at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. My kind of main body of work is family economic security, but I've been doing trauma-informed care work, I would say, maybe about the last 5 to 7 years, going deeper into that. So glad to be here today. And I will turn it over to Elizabeth Starr.
Thank you, Paula, and thank you, Jesse, for asking me to participate. Elizabeth Starr, based out of Charlotte, North Carolina, but fund across the Carolinas and nationally. Honored to be here today. I'm from the HopeStar Foundation. And again, we focus on maternal and child health. And we also focus and look at how families, centering families, how can we prevent the long-term effects of ACEs and trauma on a family. And I am just, again, excited to be here, and I get to interview Jesse, which I'm very excited about when we get further in. Welcome.
Appreciate that, Liz. And thank you for agreeing. Don't just thank me for asking you to be a part of it. Thank you for agreeing very, very much. And Carla, if you don't mind taking a second to introduce yourself as well.
Sure. I am Carla McCullough, and I'm based out of Jackson, Mississippi. And I want to say thank you for inviting me to be a part as well. I am the Executive Director of the Juanita Sims Doty Foundation here in Jackson. And we do direct service as well as systems service work throughout the country.
Thanks so much, Carla. Yeah. As we pull this up, for those who have joined a little bit later, we would love to just went through some brief introductions. Would love to know where all of you are calling in from if you haven't shared that yet and would like to. When we were thinking about how to orient and start this briefing, we had talked about starting with a poem. And at my board meeting last week, our board chair shared a poem called Turning to One Another by Margaret Wheatley. And in work that is so oriented around relationships, we thought that that may be an appropriate poem to start with. There is no power greater than a community discovering what it cares about. Ask what's possible, not what's wrong. Keep asking. Notice what you care about. Assume that many others share your dreams. Be brave enough to start a conversation that matters. Talk to people you know, talk to people you don't know, and talk to people you never talk to. Be intrigued by the differences you hear. Expect to be surprised. Treasure curiosity more than certainty. Invite in everybody who cares to work on what's possible. Acknowledge that everyone is an expert about something. Know that creative solutions come from new connections. Remember, you don't fear people whose story you know. Real listening always brings people closer together. Trust that meaningful conversations can change your world. Rely on human goodness. Stay together. Was never a poet. That is much better than anything that I could have written myself, but just grounding us in the orientation around the relational well-being and connections that we have in this work, both at an individual level, at an organization level, and across systems, is so important in terms of what we are going to be discussing today. To start, I just want to go for a few minutes here to discuss systemic trauma and trauma at a systems level, because very frequently we talk about and understand how trauma impacts individuals, but fail to see the ways in which trauma also impacts families, communities, organizations, and broader systems. As you can see on this slide, which deserves a pad in and of itself, we know that we are dealing with a number of different public health concerns and negative outcomes that are magnifying and growing and cascading throughout our society, from the state of emergency on youth mental health to overdose deaths and cascading violence. We have increasing extreme weather events across the country, are experiencing employee and worker burnout as well as student level burnout. We are experiencing institutional and structural racism, or we have been experiencing all of this for some time and coming to terms with all of that. And we have mounting debt. And so frequently, we deal with these things in silos. We deal with each of these individual outcomes without recognizing that there is a common underlying root cause that is driving and perpetuating each of these outcomes. And this slide is called a syndemic, which is a linked set of public health outcomes with a root cause. Syndemic as a term has become a much more palatable word since the pandemic, of course. But what we need to start to do and what we are recognizing and trying to coordinate strategy around is how do we not just address the individual outcomes that we're seeing at a policy level. A lot of times we see patchwork policy that is trying to essentially put a Band-Aid on a bullet hole, but we need to do a better job of coming together and coordinating and aligning around trauma and other root causes that are driving each of these outcomes, while also doing the important work of addressing the individual outcomes and the ramifications themselves. As we know, trauma creates fragmentation, siloing, and fracturing over time at an individual, family, community, and systems level. And so those siloed approaches are somewhat understandable through a trauma-informed lens. But what we need to recognize, like I said earlier, is that we can't just put the onus and burden of trauma and resilience at the individual level. We need to recognize how traumatized systems perpetuate stress and adversity disproportionately on marginalized communities and families and individuals that then create predictable outcomes at the individual, family, and community level. Of course, there are protective factors that exist as well at all of those levels. And so trauma itself is not predictable, but we know that that developmental adversity and the progression of adversity across the lifespan of an individual, family, community, or system creates negative outcomes at a higher level than would if we had prevented or mitigated against the stress and adversity that was creating those outcomes. And we know that good policy, good solutions, good practice can create conditions of empowerment and safety that help to buffer against the stress that is felt by trauma, by that stress and adversity. And that is where a truly public health approach becomes so important. In our society, we have somewhat of a treatment-first approach, at least too frequently, where we aren't doing enough at a systems level to prevent trauma in the first place. We are strengthening intervention systems, but so frequently we wait for there to be dysregulation at a level or some sort of impact at a level that it needs treatment. And that is creating such a burden of needing to having more people to treat without being able to have the workforce necessary to provide the treatments necessary. We cannot treat our way out of the intractable problems that our society has developed and is experiencing. We need to develop much more of a systems level approach that allows for us to alleviate the burden on these treatment and intervention systems alone, that allow for them to do better work, that allow for us to meet more people's needs and create positively perpetuating cycles throughout our society, as opposed to just trying to provide treatment to those who have access to it. This may sound like theory, but we have seen at a community level and at a state level that policies and practices have been able to change the trajectories of multiple outcomes all at once through a community-led trauma-informed, prevention-oriented, resilience-focused, and healing-centered framework. And the best example, at least in literature, that we have of that is the work of the Family Policy Council in Washington State from 1994 to 2011, now known as the Self-Healing Communities Model, where they built what they called general community capacity, layered learning, and looked at the results over time and had a focal point of collecting specific pieces of data. And where it says leadership expansion, we're not just talking about policymakers. We are talking about recognizing that all community members are leaders and have agency and power to get involved in this process. And as a result, in one county, they reduced youth suicide and suicide attempts by 98%. They reduced teen pregnancy, high school dropout rates, juvenile justice system involvement by nearly 50% over the course of a decade, all at once, again, by addressing that root cause. And as a result of these efforts, created a 35x return on investment, more than $1.1 billion in cost avoidance for the state was created or generated by these investments, and sustained community investment over time and building community capacity to make their own decisions. There was a lot of educational work that went into this, but we know that this is an effective approach by taking a holistic lens. And so I tried to skirt over a lot in a short amount of time. I hope that that made some level of sense. But as we get into this conversation, recognizing philanthropy's role in helping to coordinate and align our investments across various systems is the conversation that we hope to have today. And so, Paula, with that, I hope that that's a decent lead into what you're going to share, but I will pull up your slides and turn it over to you for the first part of this conversation.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. That was incredible. I had not seen Jesse's slides yet, but it just absolutely reaffirms the need to really, do this systems approach and also come at it like the social determinants of health, and how we need to think about this, because way too often so much is siloed. So again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here because there's so much happening in the world that's really hard. I'm actually a former therapist by training. So in my past, I've seen a lot of individualized trauma, but seeing it community-wide now. Next slide. So just a little bit about our foundation, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, and who we are and kind of why and how do we come to this work. So we're about creating the conditions that help families and children really thrive and be successful across school, work, and life. And most of my career, I did national work. And so I've been doing place-based work about a long time, but full-time in Mississippi, New Orleans, kind of the southern region about the last 5 years. And it matters greatly where you're at in the country, especially when you're talking about equitable conditions and equitable communities. So we have work across education, health, family economic security, but we also have what we call our DNA work, and that is racial equity, leadership development, and community engagement. Next slide. So, the one thing I want to say is we've really witnessed nationally and in our places and in our those priority areas you saw, we're seeing so much more trauma, especially for marginalized communities of color. And it shows up, as Jesse said, like in the work that I do across employment equity and higher education, retention outcomes, persistence, people's executive function skills, there's many challenges, and then health and especially mental health. So, we've seen the pandemic and the way it's impacted so many outcomes. We've seen the ensuing health and economic fallout, a lot of civil unrest that's happening, climate change, great political divide, just very, very toxic community violence, and now the shifting winds after the affirmative action decision as well. So, you know, communities are really struggling, and this trauma-informed and also healing-centered approaches through a systems lens is really, really critical. And next slide. So, you know, with trauma, often, you know, Jesse showed you a very complex slide that's really looking at systems, but just to say, you know, trauma is often thought of individual experiences, like people who are experiencing the effects of a specific incident or violence or abuse, but there's definitely also collective trauma and that communities experience. And then there's definitely racialized trauma due to you know, historical or ongoing discriminatory and oppressive systems and practices of racism or racialized violence. So that trauma can have an adverse lasting effect on our mental, physical, social, emotional well-being, especially if it's not addressed. You hear a lot about PTSD. But as Jesse said, I think it's really important not to kind of focus only on the individual and kind of blame the victim to, you know, or try to have the individual be resilient, but we really need to look at the responsibility of systems that perpetuate trauma or racialized trauma. Next slide. So what I want to say about this is at the Kellogg Foundation, we don't have explicit strategies, you know, like that we share with the public, but they're embedded within the education, health, and employment equity bodies of work that we do. But what I will say is that these 4 areas are where we have been investing. A lot of the work I've been involved with, we've been doing this. So you'll see trauma-informed, family-centered coaching and case management across very, you know, sectors of health, education, community action agencies, just the like, and then addressing racialized trauma in systems. You'll hear from Dr. McCullough today. We're also doing some trauma-informed work with educational curriculum, professional development, early ed systems, and then some healing work and leadership development in the South. So next slide. So this first one I want to talk about is the Kellogg Foundation. A couple things. So we were doing a pilot and we realized a lot of the work, it's either focused on the adult or the child, but not the whole family. So, and then coaching or case management is often kind of siloed in the same way. So one, we really wanted to focus on the family. And then we also wanted to put families in the driver's seat, be strength-based. So we formed an advisory group. It took us a year and a half or so. We did a scan of the whole nation to see what are the ones out there. And sometimes they're like financially based or only on employment. But what could we do that is family-centered, focus on all the facets of somebody's life? Based in the latest brain research, it's trauma-informed, it has a racial equity lens, it addresses executive function. So this was open source, non-proprietary, and place-based, and there's a national learning community. So not going into too much detail, but it's definitely takes the systems lens. The people don't need to know about it. It's more the coaches, supervisors. You need to do organizational culture change so that it is sustainable. But we've trained 2,500 plus family-centered coaches. It's scaled to 27 states. And it's been implemented in 138 different organizations and agencies across many different sectors. So I have more information on that particular model. Next slide. The one thing I was excited to show is that one of our grantees, the Brighton Center, they were able to, they get WIOA funding, so it's workforce funding essentially. And the goals they have here are kind of what they normally achieve without family-centered coaching across all these different employment, placement, credential attainment, et cetera. So you can see here, fiscal year 19 and 20, that how much higher it is with family-centered coaching. So you're getting some hardcore outcomes here around employment and retention, credential attainment, et cetera. So that was really exciting for us to see in an employment space. Next slide. And then this, I don't know why the words aren't, that's weird. The words aren't showing up. Maybe there's a delay, but the one thing I wanted to say is for this one, how strange.
I
Okay.
apologize, Paul. I'm
Oh,
not sure
that's
what
okay.
happened, but the words aren't on my version. Yeah.
Yeah, so this, what it says is addressing racialized trauma in systems. So this is the Juanita Simsdody Foundation in Mississippi. And you'll hear Dr. McCullough talk more about it, but it's really about addressing systematic racialized trauma caused by dehumanizing practices and systems for people of color, and then creating systems level trauma-informed and healing solutions. Next slide. So if you could see the words here, it would say trauma-informed educational curriculum and professional development, early education. The Glenn Family Foundation, trauma-informed social emotional goal setting curriculum, and what's called ACEs, awareness in grades K through 5 to improve outcomes for children. We also have an Institute for Women's Ethnic Studies in New Orleans, and they're about improving children's academic and developmental outcomes by providing trauma-responsive instruction and intervention and professional development. Next slide. Oh, look, the words came back. That's great. And I love this one. So this is the Women's Foundation of the South. It's a newer foundation that started a few years ago, but they have what's called Women of Color at Rest, or Woke at Rest, and they bring together these like nonprofit executive directors, leaders who are women of color, and they have a 2-day healing retreat. So rest is restore, elevate, support, and tell their story. They get a personal development grant, and then capacity building with Gen Ops, and then they do storytelling sessions. And so it's very, very powerful to do that self-care so that you can show up better out in the world in all the work you're doing. And last slide. So, you know, for us, with some of that work, what I would say the goals of some of this trauma informed and healing centered strategies at the systems level, we're really trying to scale the work across systems in place and nationally, because we want to get to as many families as we can. We also invest in learning communities. That's been a part of some of our work, to share best practice and lessons learned so you can go further, better, faster. The organizational agency culture change piece is so important, because there's no way you can go in and train like a one case manager and expect it to just spread. Like, you have to work with the entire agency, the entire organization. And then, of course, addressing racialized trauma. That's different, and it's very deep-seated, and you know, trying to shift that. And then ultimately, you want healthier outcomes across all the different things, right? Health, employment, education. And then kind of as Jesse alluded to, not the individual blame or pull yourself up by your bootstraps, but really looking at the systems and how do we begin to shift the narrative and mental models to get to systems change. So that is the work we've been engaged in. And so now you can take the slides off. So I'm really excited now to be able to introduce Dr. Carla McCullough. You heard her introduce herself. Again, she's the executive director of the Juanita Simsdody Foundation. But to start out, Dr. McCullough, I wanted to ask you, how did you come to this trauma-informed care work in the first place? And what problems or issues were you trying to solve or address?
Yeah, thank you, Paula. So we really came to this systems work organically. Our organization was founded in 2011 based on our direct service work. for the youth. And our mission was to positively impact the youth and their families in health and education. But what we realized is, regardless of how much work we did with the direct services with the youth themselves, they would always go back home to parents and families and engage in systems that still provided them with sometimes dehumanizing feelings and trauma. And so we elaborated on our mission to provide the youth with the tools that they needed to navigate a challenging world, but while preparing the world to receive them. And the preparing the world to receive them is the systems work. We started with creating a curriculum for our mentors on rules of engagement for the youth and the best ways to be effective and impactful when having conversations and engaging as mentors. For example, the first question that I do in the training, I say, well, if you come across a youth and you ask them, what color is the sky? And they say red. It's not our jobs to tell them it's blue, but to find out their eyes. Because we know in trauma, there's 3 E's. It's the events, the experiences, and then the effects. And so as we were training our mentors to say, we have to look at the experience to understand the effects that often demonstrate themselves in behaviors. And so we centered it around the dehumanization cycle, which outlined the issues. And this dehumanization cycle was created by Drs. Rhonda Sawyer-Fat Bryant and Dr. Stevens. And it in turn talks about those 3 E's. There are 4 elements to the cycle, and I'll just start with the negative narratives. So negative narratives that talk about the ways in which marginalized communities, who they are and what they do. And it often ends up being a rationale for the second element, which is dangerous actions that manifest themselves in policies, practices, the way that they are treated on a regular basis. And with these dangerous actions, if youth pay attention and they listen, and sometimes it becomes internal, then it creates harmful internal feelings. So that element ultimately can cause helplessness and hopelessness, the trauma that we talk about, as well as just repetitive trauma of what they continue to say to themselves. And then as a result of that element of harmful internal feelings, there could be destructive external reactions, which manifest themselves as harm to themselves or maybe even harm to others. And so with this type of trauma and destructive external reactions, if we don't support the youth and intervene because of what they've experienced, but we do it because of who they are, then the negative narratives begin again. Mm-hmm. And that's the cycle. And so as we created that, we didn't create the cycle, but as we used the framework of the cycle, we recognized in our trainings that many of the people who support the youth, many of the systems that they're engaged in, because we know from our research that most of the youth in our program, over 2,000 we've served, that they are in at least 2 of the 5 systems that we researched. And the 5 systems we researched were education, health, mental health, justice, and support services. So if they are encountering possible dehumanizing engagements within these systems, then it causes trauma again. Mm. And so that systems work, what we've done is we've identified ways to say, with this system, you have the power to change one of the elements in this cycle, whether it's negative narratives, or it's the way they feel, or it's the way they're interacted with policies, practices, procedures, and decisions. You can change and disrupt this cycle and the way that our youth are feeling and being engaged with by changing your policies, practices, procedures, and decisions. And that's how we started with the systems work.
Got it. So then once you realized or recognized that, what you needed to do with those systems, how did that, I guess, manifest, and what did that look like as you move forward?
So it was really organic. It was organic because we started at the local level, training our mentors who are a part of our system. We have over 250 mentors across the country. And then we started to train community organizations in the way that they engage. And it just so happened that I was doing a healing center workshop, trauma-informed workshop with a state, and there was a state social worker there. And after my presentation, she came up and she said, if I had had this information when I was in the field, I would have changed the way I interacted with my clients. And so she started to change the way she taught the social workers who were being supervised by her based on this dehumanization cycle and the information that she learned. And then as a result of that, of course, we still are and were at that time doing trainings for colleges and universities, historically Black colleges, as well as PWIs to talk about ways that they could change the systems as they interact with marginalized communities. But along the way, someone introduced us to a federal agency who said, can you teach us what it did, train us on ways to have trauma-informed and healing-centered practices as we talk with our client base. And ultimately, as we began and created our framework and our training series, we recognized that this type of training was about evolution. We disrupt the cycle, but if we're going to have an evolution of more trauma-informed and responsive systems, then it's going to be incremental change. And that's how we got started.
Wow, that's really incredible. Just the acknowledgement of how each of those systems that touch young people and really figuring that out on how you need to then shift and pivot in order to get to different outcomes. Can you talk about some of the results that you've seen in your work to date?
Yeah, absolutely. So from the local level, of course, we talked about the training that we did with the mentors. Well, of course, we do evaluations and we get the responses back, and then we change as we need to with the next trainings and things like that. Well, one of the main comments that we received from mentors is that they never really thought about the trauma that our youth have encountered and how their engagement could be positive or negative based on what they've experienced. So just having that feedback from the mentors was tremendous. And then we utilized their feedback when we started to do community organizations. And I mentioned the social worker and her feedback to us and the way that she was going to be training the social workers for whom she supervised. Those are tremendous impacts and results that we had. Then also right now, we're engaged with 2 federal agencies. And within those agencies, we've had one of the human resources. They created a series that aligns lived experiences with work experience, because what we know is marginalized communities who have experienced trauma. And when we talk about inequity in systems, they may not have the same work experience because of lack of access and opportunity. That is a significant change. And then also there was a letter that went out to the entire agency on equity and trauma-informed policies, practices, procedures, and decisions that everyone gets to read about and also provide their input. And so what we know is that they're seeing it on a regular basis and becoming more familiar. And we know, just based on research, of course, the more you practice it and see it, the more it's going to come natural. And then it changes and inherently inequitable and sometimes trauma-causing system. And then finally, I could talk about a million of them, but one I do want to highlight is often in our work, when we're doing this training, we have within agencies and organizations, the decision and maybe one or two people who we're training to do this. Well, within one of the agencies, we have half the staff. We're talking about 36 people who join us on these trainings on a weekly basis because we created a systems process and not a person-driven process, because we know in systems people will change, but if it's based on the system, it's sustainable and it's scalable. And so we've been able to see that as a fantastic result.
That's wonderful. It's great to hear that you're engaged with federal partners and how, this is moving forward. Before I turn it back to Jesse and Elizabeth, I just want to ask, do you have any final words or lessons you want to share with the funders or something to think about?
Well, as far as lessons, I know just from experience and the last 13 years that we've been doing this work is that organizations who do this work have to be human-centered. And it has to be driven by the voices of the people for whom the system serve, as well as directed by lived experiences. I know in mental health, there are peer support specialists. Well, that's because we know the clients will more than likely respond to people who've designed policy, who've been there before. And so because of that, we put together a training and we're now developing a curriculum will allow us to train health and race equity specialists to do what we're doing. And so this will help ensure that it is scalable and that it is sustainable with this system's work.
Well, thank you
And
so much. Yeah.
I was just going to say because I can talk about this over and over again, I'll be happy to put my information in the chat if anyone wants to have further questions about it.
Great. Thank you so much, Dr. McCullough. Really wise advice, not about them without them, but also people with lived experience kind of engaging with others so that, you understand. Thank you again. And now I will turn it, I think, over to Liz Starr.
I think actually I am going to turn it to Jesse for a second and say that it's going to be really hard to follow both of you and the amazing work and the breadth and the depth of your work, not only in the Southeast, but across the country. So Paula, thank you for that vision and for the work that you're doing again, nationally, in the community, in the South. So thank you for bringing it forward. But I'll turn it over to Jesse to set the stage.
No, I appreciate that, Liz. I had the sincere pleasure of getting to meet Liz and several other people on this call that will definitely mention as we built a foundation of support around the work that we do at CTIPP. The Campaign for Trauma-Informed Policy and Practice was founded in 2015 by leaders in the trauma-informed movement for two main reasons. One was that there was a missing federal policy and advocacy voice around the impact of trauma. There was very little understanding of what ACEs were, a lack of a recognition of the deep insidious wounds that occur. A lot of times policymakers, we would go into offices. One of our founders, Dan Press, talked about how they would think about car accidents and sort of occurrences that happened at war, but there wasn't really a greater understanding of how trauma permeates throughout our society. And then the other place is that within the trauma-informed movement, there was incredible siloing that was going on. And so there was work in trauma-informed education, healthcare, criminal legal system, and so on. But there was missing a comprehensive vision for what a truly trauma-informed society that was integrated actually looked like. And so that's where we were founded. We did work unfunded for 5 years. We weren't funded until COVID came on, and it was through the support of Liz the Burke Foundation, and others from the beginning that really gave us a foundation to grow upon, because we had launched a national campaign because we knew that it was so important to have constituent voice. It was actually from then Chairman Elijah Cummings, following a legislative briefing that told us, why are there not more advocates talking to us about this? And so we wanted to co-create a campaign that had an infrastructure all around the country, which I think Liz and Atia and folks from the Burke Foundation is where we got to know you all, was as we launched this grassroots campaign. But we would come out with resources, and I'll talk more about what we've been able to do since there has been more support and our vision for the future. But with that, Liz, want to turn it over to you because you've had such an interest in addressing trauma. I know that you do work predominantly in North Carolina, but saw how we as a national organization could support the work that you were invested in North Carolina. And then we'll get into our conversation from there.
Perfect. And thank you. Thank you. And I appreciate all the work that you've done. And I think understanding, and I think Dr. McCullough said it really well, is that there is so much great work happening I think from what I've seen, especially in North Carolina and across the country, building out trauma-informed systems. Sometimes what I don't see as much as is the connection between the amazing work happening on the ground and the work happening at top, especially again, in some examples, but there are states that got it and they are great examples of the work that's happening. New Jersey, Washington, you can name 5 or 6 that are killing it, shall we say. When I first met Jesse, again, and Dan, going back, I think I've been funding 4 years, but probably 5 or 6. That was really the vision that Jesse had, which was, how do you build out state coalitions as well as linking it to the work at the national level. And that conversation is so important because it does need to go both ways. We do need to understand how we can talk about federal policy, because that does come through to our states. And so I think that combination of understanding Jesse's vision of what it would look like to bring best practices to a state bring best practices up to the federal level has been a real game changer from the work that I have been seeing across, again, Carolinas, but really across the country, which has really helped. And I think, I don't know if Atia or her team is on. I think I saw a couple. Jessica, hello. Quick call out, but one of the best examples of that is I was at a meeting and I happened to have been carrying, Tia didn't know this, I was carrying a book, a 30-page document funded by family philanthropies in New Jersey called Resilient New Jersey. And it gave you a step-by-step of quote unquote, how to build out a state infrastructure. And I remember meeting her and being like, wait, are you the one who can do this? So I think philanthropy, which is a reason why I think we're here to talk about, and really why I think Jesse spoke to both of us, is philanthropy can seed, philanthropy can raise, philanthropy can use this space to build a coalition that moves the work forward. And so everybody takes a different part of the work. And so we are not saying you need to take this part or that part. Not at all. The conversation is pockets across the country are doing great work. How do we bring it all under, I don't want to say the umbrella, but basically one umbrella, so we can learn, fund momentum, and leverage the amazing funding that's going on in this space across the country. One of the best things I'll say about Paula, when she asked me to speak on a panel with her, I think was a children's roundtable. She had a very different way, right, approach of looking at the work. And I learned so much from saying, that's totally different than how we're approaching it here, in North Carolina. And just that learning has really helped. And then again, hearing Dr. McCullough and the work that she's doing as well. So I appreciate that. And really, Jesse has taught me and Dan a lot, and I will hopefully I've taught him a couple things. I remember when he was doing his first RFP and we were going through it and marking some things up. So again, he's been a great partner along with really so many other people on this call. And so the purpose again was just to bring some best practices to you guys, but also to interview Jesse and his team and ask a couple of questions. And then from there, discuss how or why or if we can do some work together collectively across the country. So Jesse, I hope that I didn't ruin your ask at the end or any of that, but if that sounds okay. Good. Okay.
All
If we have
good.
any questions,
Well,
stick them in the chat. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so Liz, we had a few questions for us
Yes, we
that
do.
we had discussed where
Yes.
you touched on. First of all, I just want to highlight a few of the ways that Liz has actually modeled trauma-informed approaches
Talk about me.
through
Okay.
philanthropy and others as well. One that you brought up is that at first, having been a volunteer organization, it was very difficult to put dollar values in a proposed budget to things that we had been doing for $0 at first. And you worked with us to help us understand where you saw there being potential value and how we could build out a budget. You did the same thing, and Atia just dropped in the chat the report that you had mentioned. So thank you for that, Atia. But that was huge. Another thing, in addition to the connection with the Burke Foundation, you also helped make a connection to the Oak Foundation, and Bethiel is on the call, where we are now able to amplify our work around advocacy to support young people's advocacy, because so much of the advocacy work that we do is about young people. And we've been talking about how to transform the education system. How do we support young people? But in the spirit of nothing about us without us, we needed to do more support than just the practitioners that were in our sort of the first round of our community advocacy network, CTIPP CAN, that we have. And so that introduction was transformative, where it hasn't just been about funding, it's been about partnership and sharing in that vision that we hold together in the different ways that we and other partners, and the introduction to Paula and others on this call. Hopefully I have met many of you, would love to meet all of you and know everybody's work about this, but that has been really key. And two other pieces that I just want to highlight, and then I'm happy to either speak to certain things or we can get into the Q&A, because I don't want to dominate the conversation. But two other things. One is that moving from a volunteer organization to a funded organization, the transition of the board from a volunteer board to a managing board takes time, because people need to be nurtured into where they came onto the board with certain expectations, and then new roles, and the support that we've had from a number of foundations in that level of capacity building support has been huge. And then the other thing is that when we first got funded, you and Burke actually let us hold on to a lot of the funding, because we wouldn't have been able to afford staff capacity with the very generous gifts. And so we were able to use some of the funding for a CRM platform that allowed for our advocacy efforts to enhance. Burke helped us with a communications project that allowed for us to talk about ourselves in a more digestible way, because we had gotten so wonky about the work that we were doing at CTIPP that it was difficult sometimes to communicate about our work. But we were able to hold on to a fair amount of that capacity, so that way when we added on the following year, we were able to build a staff instead of just spending all of the money that we needed to, but really strategically spend over time. And that investment, that level of investment in us, was so important to get to where we are now. I am still on loan as executive director from a think tank and another organization, because that allowed for us to build our capacity to where I was able to strategically leverage my time to continue to do the work that needed to be done while we brought on other team members. And that was so important, because we couldn't have possibly anticipated it. But when Dan got sick, and Dan unfortunately passed away, when we first met, I was 25 years old, and I was sort of the right-hand man, right? And I was really good learning from a 75-plus-year-old attorney who had been doing this work for his whole career. And then because of events that we couldn't have predicted, you were able to support us in being able to leverage other supports that allowed for our team to remain strong despite that incredible organizational trauma that we had through the loss of Dan, which has allowed for us to heal. And then through post-traumatic growth, post-traumatic wisdom, I know that we'll talk about, press on for at least a second, we have been able to grow from that experience and emerge as a strong organization, despite what could have easily broken us without your investment, your partnership throughout these really difficult, the past few years. as he was sick and last year since we lost him.
Well, thank you, Jesse. And a lot of it goes to you building out the infrastructure and having a strong vision. But I really do want to ask you a couple of questions as you have continued to make this really everybody. And could you just talk for a second a little bit about your infrastructure, kind of how, because some people might not know all about CTIPP, maybe even just and people may, but 2 seconds on your infrastructure and, everyone knows what CTIPP stands for, but 2 seconds on that, kind of how you structured now.
So we promote advocacy and really try to uplift folks being able to promote their own calls to action. We don't see ourselves as necessarily telling everyone what trauma-informed advocacy looks like. That is very authoritarian. That is not a trauma-informed approach to advocacy. We really try to build up grassroots level support all across the country. That's our community advocacy network. We have monthly calls. We promote resources that are free, and all of our resources are always free to try to build up that grassroots advocacy. And we do promote a few bills specifically around cross-sector community coalitions that have bipartisan, bicameral support at the federal level, while our capacity is small, to try and build up community capacity. And that gets into our other main pieces around building cross-sector community coalitions that really enable this work to happen through a practice lens at the grassroots level, as well as at the state level. And we try to bring together groups at a national level. So that way we are coordinating and aligning efforts and allow for culturally sensitive practices to emerge at the community level, because we know that each community's work is going to look different based on the population's needs, resources, and desires of that community. But we can create conditions, like we were talking about earlier, of empowerment and support and safety that allow for those coalitions to emerge. And then as we build out our advocacy supports and the coalition supports, we are promoting what we call press on, which is this bi-directional flow where we are able to learn from emerging practices that are happening in communities, network across communities and states and regions that are doing this work to learn from one another. And as our capacity grows through Ideas Lab, which is where we develop resources and toolkits. We've done ones on workforce development, education, cross-sector community coalitions, and many, many more. We are able to build upon that foundation to learn from what communities are really doing and expedite the evidence base to then take that to policymakers, take that to other communities to learn from, and then propel the movement forward. And that building out that infrastructure at a national to state to regional to local level, which is so important because we know that healing happens in the context of healthy relationships over time, which is not going to happen sitting 100 feet above the ground in Washington, D.C. That is going to happen from folks who are in the grassroots of communities every single day. Building out that infrastructure that is coordinating and aligning across the movement is where we hope to go. I know that you said take 2 seconds. I took 2 minutes.
No, I'm glad you did. And it helps to talk a little bit about what role you play, in this work. And that's what I think is interesting. I don't know, again, if everyone knew about you or they didn't. So I appreciate that. And I think there's you, and then there's 2 more staff or 3 more staff people that you have.
Yeah, so we have myself on loan. We have 2 part-time folks that do, Whitney is our director of trauma-informed practice and systems transformation, which is research working with communities, presenting in a lot of our educational materials. Laura is our director of communications and outreach, so that way we're updating our website, reaching as many people as possible. And then through the generosity of the Oak Foundation, we brought on a gentleman by the name of Antron McCullough, who is our director of empowerment and engagement, who right now his main project, among other things, is building out that youth advocacy series and providing that intermediary support that is supporting a trauma-informed approach to uplifting youth voice, inclusive of young people with learning differences.
I love that. That's awesome. Can you give us, just because I guess I don't know if I'm visual or I'm not, but one example maybe of something that you pulled through that actually, if it, made it to either built within a policy recommendation or something that you can say, you can point to and say, this was influenced by the work of CTIPP.
Yeah, so last year we helped support a piece of legislation called the Post-Disaster Mental Health Response Act that got passed, which reauthorized FEMA funds. So that way, not just major disasters, but also emergency declarations had counseling support come out as a result of when FEMA dollars are unlocked. It wasn't just for the heaviest events. It was anytime that FEMA dollars are unleashed, there is capacity for what's called CCP, which is like Community and Counseling Support Program. And then I think that another really beautiful example of that grassroots initiative is we did a lot of work after the American Rescue Plan Act to support folks understanding where the stimulus funds were going to flow down and how they could leverage and who to talk to and providing talking points at a state and local level. And, Baltimore City leveraged over $1 million for the Healing Cities Act implementation. Oklahoma leveraged over $9 million or something like that for early childhood supports. And so being able to provide and understand where the funding was going to flow enabled advocates to be able to ask and advocate for their own funding that then supported programs on the ground.
That's great. That is awesome. I want to take a break. I do have a question, but I just want to know if anybody has any questions, put it in the chat. I was looking, I didn't see any yet, but if anybody has any questions, please add them to the question. And I really have one more question, and it's going to talk about, we all know, and I'm throwing out, and I know there's more, so I'm just going to put a couple: Resilient Georgia, Resilient Tennessee, Office of Resilience in New Jersey, Heal PA, Office of Wellness of Resilience, Hawaii, the Arizona ACES Consortium. I am so sorry, that is only to name a few of the work happening. What are you seeing, again, the next steps in this movement? And maybe, it's huge. It's like I'm asking you to tell me what's going to happen in 5 years. I don't mean that. But what I mean is, what are you seeing coming up from all these amazing resources at the state level, now at federal? What are you seeing coming across?
So, there's been work out of what was called the Interagency Task Force on Trauma-Informed Care at the federal level. What I think comes next at the state level, because we have seen so many states, and Dr. McCullough, Paula, and anybody else, I want to include you in the conversation as well. Don't mean to dominate by any stretch, but I think that what is needed is, like, even in two states that touch each other, you got Resilient Tennessee, you got Resilient Georgia, you have several efforts even in North Carolina. There needs to be more connection, collaboration to learn from what folks have been seeing as successful and not, which I think is the next step. There is wonderful work going on across the country that folks can learn from, and there just is not that level of coordination, connection, conversation that is happening, which is so important. And then I do think that what we are seeing more and more of a recognition of, and to call out Resilient GA, I think that they do a wonderful job and have an incredible model doing this. But at a state level, building capacity at a community level to hyper localize the ways in which this work is being done, and then provide that shared learning and resource mapping at a state level. And then across states, we can do that at a federal level. But again, through the press on infrastructure, our vision to hyper localize the work, that is how we can see the work really taking place in community while coordinating efforts at a state level, while coordinating across states and regions at a national level, that allows for us to break out of the silos that we currently exist within, but creates that coordination and alignment that will really heal the systemic trauma that we were talking about at the beginning of this call.
Great. Thank you, Jesse. Thank you so much.
No.
That was kind of my last question. And then I think I'd love to know if you guys, at some point, we can send out, if there's an advocacy agenda that you do have, on a one-pager or something. I think that'd be interesting for people to see on the national level. If you have some things that you're working on, that would be excellent.
I can put into the chat the two bills that I discussed earlier. I want to, in addition to opening up for further conversation, Paula, if I can ask you a quick question while I find that resource, and I'll put a few in the chat.
Rush. We can wait, Jesse.
What's that?
We can wait. I can send it as a link.
No, it's all good. But Paula, we had talked about sort of like networking and mapping across the movement as something that we wanted to have as an outcome of this call, and hopefully other calls in the future. And I don't know if you want to speak to a little bit more of that vision, where we hope to go from there.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. I think the idea, part of what came up and over time is that sometimes when philanthropy, we're all funding all these different things, and sometimes, nonprofits are creating different things, and it gets a little bit confusing for folks to wade through all the information to figure out where is this, who's doing that. And part of what we thought would be really, really incredible is some kind of map or toolkit or something that shows, if you're interested in this model, trauma-informed philanthropy or healing-centered engagement, here's all the folks who are doing that. Here's what states they're in, and here's what stage they're in. I just think that would be really helpful for the field, because as we were doing this family-centered coaching and some of the other things we're investing in, people would be confused about, well, how is this different than what they're doing over here? Or maybe is it similar, So that's part of that thinking. And I just love Jesse and Liz, all the incredible work that you've been lifting up, and even for pulling me in with some of these deeper conversations, because I think that's a really important piece, is to, get to the policy and systems change, and to make sure we're accelerating as much information as we can across the country, given the times that we're in.
You, Paula, and you were going in and out, but Jesse, is there? Oh yeah, no, I gotcha. Is there? I know I can see people. Some people have to come out, some people don't. But I just wanted to make sure that we were answering any questions. But Jesse, there was a question back there, and Atia answered. But just to make sure, the question from Hannah here was how much. What was her? Oh yeah, what are the cost of these models? Do you have any insight on that? Atia came back and said they pulled about $1 million over 3 years to set up a statewide coordinating body.
Yeah, it depends on the model, right? Is it existing within a government infrastructure? It's harder to determine how much that costs, because it's existing resources and staff time and a reallocation of government funds. Whereas, to what Atia was talking about, sort of the ways in which they were able to pool money that developed the Office of Resilience in New Jersey was a little bit higher. I can't speak to the specific models because it depends on who you bring in. I can say that for Washington State, the amount of cost to work and invest sustainably across the 42 communities that they worked in, granted, these dollars are from 1994 to 2011, so we'll take a frame to understand inflation will have pushed these numbers up a little bit. But across that many communities centralized at a state level, I believe that it averaged around $4 to $6 million a year. The investment in the Family Policy Council itself and that work that then created that $1.1 billion in cost avoidance over 17 years of investment. And so we know that the return on investment over time is so much greater. It is not a small amount of funding that is necessary, but relative to what we see being put into specific programs and policies that are trying to address specific outcomes, the cost can be relatively low, and then obviously can scale up from there, but it doesn't need to be exorbitantly high.
And philanthropy can seed, do the backbone, things like that, with the intention that the state or the feds will come in and help to manage some of that, or that public-private partnership we were talking about.
Yeah.
That's great. That's awesome.
I know for the family-centered coaching, for example, we help kind of seed and launch and all that. Over time, I don't know, at least 5 years, we've invested probably 1.5 to 2 million maybe, but then there's been other models where it's been a couple $100,000. So it's just a range, and it just depends. And then just to say too, that the best part is like when you get the public-private match, and we had Department of Labor out in Connecticut come in and fund some things, and more at the federal level. So
Amazing. That's completely amazing. Jesse, do you have anything else that you think that you've got this amazing group of funders? And I know to plant a seed, not for now, but maybe later on, maybe there is a national, maybe there is a national a conference, that we can look at, or, maybe there's an appetite potentially for a national conference, maybe a 1-day funder, and the other 2 days are for practitioners. So just a couple thoughts about where to go next.
Yeah, and Dr. McCullough, I would love to share that question with you, if you're comfortable with that. But for us, I think that the vision is that there's no reason that conferences and networking events within states couldn't happen more frequently, within regions couldn't happen almost annually. And then through that press on infrastructure that I was talking about, we could bring together an annual conference, whether it's most effective to be every 4 years, every 2 years. We could figure that out, but to really support coordination and networking. And then through what we learned through intentional data collection, I would say that to support that public-private partnership that Paula was talking about, where philanthropy can step in and help to sustain, but we can get government to enhance and scale these efforts. What we would love to do through that data collection is also create an economic vehicle where we're learning from communities that allows for us to sustain investment through the cost avoidances that we realize, to share part of them with the government to pay off other debts or to invest in other areas that are important, but to sustain the investment over time, because we know what we would have expected with Washington State and with any community that does this is when you hit the 20, 25, 30-year mark and kids who are born into the program become parents and have children of their own, we would expect to see intergenerational transmission of trauma reduce substantially. That creates exponential returns on investment for several generations until we reach some society that looks so completely different than the one that we live in, that we would probably see a plateau, but that would take several generations. And so learn from the effective use of what communities are doing, and through data collection, create economic vehicles that allow for us to sustain and scale initiatives is a part of our vision. But Dr. McCullough, want to know, what your vision is as well, what your thoughts are.
So conference is right there. That's what we've been talking about. Maybe even a conference that allows the practitioners and clinicians who do this type of work to hear about best practices, to hear about the research that has informed things that are happening, and maybe even areas that focus on specific type of trauma-informed, whether it's in education or if it's in health or in mental health, where people can get specific information about what they can do to have more informed, trauma-informed and trauma-responsive practices. Because I would just say we have done presented our research that we utilize for our framework at the Mississippi Trauma Conference. But what we did find in that conference, we've done it twice, is that it's so varied that there are just a few people in each area. But if there were specific conferences with maybe 3 to 4 topics where people can get a deepened and thick knowledge about what they're looking for, it may be have more merit to last longer, be sustainable, and provide information on scaling.
Thank you, Dr. McCullough. And then
welcome.
Liz and Paula, I think that part of what we had discussed also was maybe at some point in the hopefully not too far future, we can bring funders together for a conference like what Dr. McCullough was just sharing, where it is funder specific, where folks can come together and brainstorm, and we can learn about what is happening successfully, where there are opportunities to learn. And then Paula, of course, that gets into the network mapping and sort of that national map of understanding where investments are happening, where investments aren't happening. So that way we are able to maximize our collective investments across multiple sectors across the country. And as I always say, hopefully all around the world. Let's see one. If there's any thoughts, we appreciate all of the time that folks have stayed with us. If there are thoughts or other questions, please don't hesitate to come off mute and share your perspectives. Lynn, I see your comment in the chat. You don't need to come off mute, but you know, we want to sort of co-create. We know that we had a stop at the 15th or at the 15-minute of the hour, and on the East Coast it's 4:15. I don't know all of the time zones that we represent, but we're happy to stay on until the half hour to continue the conversation if folks are interested.
And Jesse, I'm going to put you on the spot completely. Do you have an not an ask, but a request or something about next steps or thoughts that you have on how to best get this group together, even if needed? Or what would you like to see? Well, how can we support you in the work that you're doing?
Yeah, so without like the obvious ask, because that is just not the purpose of
No, that's not the purpose, but right.
of the call. We, you know, I think that interest in this idea, does this sound like something that folks have capacity for? Is that something that folks would be interested in? And then, you know, obviously we had a few dozen folks on this call today, but we know that the social network effect of folks who have other friends in the philanthropy space reaching out to them, so that way we can grow and build upon a working group that is helping us begin to do some asset mapping on philanthropy across the country in this space across sectors would be a really good, easy first step, I think. And just to mention, we'll be doing follow-up to share the recording if folks want to share that. And so there will be an opportunity to respond to that email and some other outreach with interest as a first step in either doing more virtual events or hopefully getting together in person to do, you know, so some work around this sort of asset mapping, I think would be a great next step.
Yeah, I think we can send out, you know, this after survey or whatever we want to call it, just to assess kind of where are you guys at? What are you interested in? Do you want to form some kind of, you know, larger group around trauma-informed and healing-centered strategies? So we, Liz, myself, and Jesse, you know, we can, and Carla, we can kind of talk through that, but get something out to you because we, you know, it's 4:13, so I know, you know, we can't answer that now, but we're looking forward to hearing back from all of you.
Thank you, everyone. And Jesse, thank you for reaching out and everyone for spending your afternoon. And I'm looking forward to learning with this group and with you, Paula. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. McCullough. It was a pleasure. So appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you, everyone. This has been really incredible. Appreciate your time.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Thank you.